Good morning, Mr. Daldis here with your Chapter 18, Section 1 reading on the eve of the Revolution. Your focus question for this section is what led to the storming of the Bastille and therefore to the start of the French Revolution. On April 28, 1789, unrest exploded at a Paris wallpaper factory. A rumor had spread that the factory owner was planning to cut wages, even though bread prices were soaring. Enraged workers vandalized the owner's home. Riots like these did not worry most nobles. They knew that France faced a severe economic crisis, but thought financial reforms would ease the problem. The nobles were wrong. The crisis went deeper than government finances. Reforms would not be enough. By July, the hungry, unemployed, and poorly paid people of Paris had taken up arms. Their actions would push events further and faster than anyone could have foreseen. French society divided. In 1789, France, like the rest of Europe, still clung to an outdated social system that had emerged in the Middle Ages. Under this Ancien Regime, or Old Order, everyone in France was divided into one of three social classes, or estates. The first estate was made up of the clergy. The second estate was made up of the nobility, and the third estate was comprised the vast majority of the population. The clergy enjoy wealth. During the Middle Ages, the Church had exerted great influence throughout Christian Europe. In 1789, the French clergy still enjoyed enormous wealth and privilege. The Church owned about 10% of the land, collected tithes, and paid no direct taxes to the state. High church leaders such as bishops and abbots were usually nobles who lived very well. Parish priests, however, often came from humble origins and might be as poor as their peasant congregations. The first estate did provide some social services. Nuns, monks, and priests ran schools, hospitals, and orphanages. But during the Enlightenment, the philosophes targeted the church for reform. They criticized the idealness of some clergy, the church's interference in politics, and its intolerance of dissent. In response, many clergy condemned the Enlightenment for undermining religion and moral order. Nobles hold top government jobs. The second estate had titled nobility of France. In the Middle Ages, noble knights had defended the land. In the 1600s, Richelieu and Louis XIV had crushed the nobles' military power but had given them other rights, under strict royal control. These rights included top jobs in government, the army, the church, and courts. At Versailles, ambitious nobles competed for royal appointments, while ideal courtiers enjoyed endless entertainments. Many nobles, however, lived far from the center of power. Though they owned land, they received little financial income. As a result, they felt the pinch of trying to maintain their status in a period of rising prices. Many nobles hated absolutism and resented the royal bureaucracy that employed middle-class men in positions that had once been reserved for them. They feared losing their traditional privileges, especially their freedom from paying taxes. Third estate is vastly diverse. The third estate was the most diverse social class. At the top sat the bourgeoisie, or middle class. The bourgeoisie included prosperous bankers, merchants, and manufacturers, as well as lawyers, doctors, journalists, and professors. The bulk of the third estate, however, consisted of rural peasants. Some were prosperous landowners who hired laborers to work for them. Others were tenant farmers or day laborers. The poorest members of the third estate were urban workers. They included apprentices, journeymen, and others who worked in industries such as printing or cloth making. Many women and men earned a meager living as servants, stable hands, construction workers, or street sellers of everything from food to pots and pans. A large number of urban poor were unemployed. To survive, they turned to begging or crime. From rich to poor, members of the third estate resented the privileges enjoyed by their social betters. Wealthy bourgeois families in the third estate could buy political office and even titles, but the best jobs were still reserved for nobles. Urban workers earned miserable wages. Even the smallest rise in the price of bread, their main food, brought the threat of great hunger or even starvation. Because of traditional privileges, the first and second estate paid almost no taxes. Peasants were burdened by taxes on everything from land to soap to salt. Though they were technically free, many owed fees and services that dated back to medieval times, such as the corvée, which was unpaid labor to repair roads and bridges. Peasants were also incensed when nobles, hurt by rising prices, tried to impose old manor dues. In towns and cities, Enlightenment ideas led people to question the inequalities of the old regime. Why, people demanded, should the first two estates have such great privileges at the expense of the majority? Throughout France, the Third Estate called for the privileged classes to pay their share. Checkpoint. What was the social structure of the old regime in France? Financial troubles. Economic woes in France added to the social unrest and heightened tensions. One of the causes of the economic troubles was the mushrooming financial crisis that was due in part to years of deficit spending. This occurs when a government spends more money than it takes in. National debt soars. Louis XIV had left France deeply in debt. The 7 Years' War and the American Revolution strained the treasury even further. Costs generally had risen in the 1700s, and the lavish court soaked up millions. To bridge the gap between income and expenses, the government borrowed more and more money. By 1789, half of the government's income from taxes went to paying the interest on this enormous debt. Also, in the late 1780s, bad harvests sent food prices soaring and brought hunger to poor peasants and city dwellers. To solve the financial crisis, the government would have to increase taxes, reduce expenses, or both. However, the nobles and clergy fiercely resisted any attempt to end their exemption from taxes. Economic reform fails. The heirs of Louis XIV were not the right men to solve the economic crisis that afflicted France. Louis XV, who ruled from 1715 to 1774, pursued the pleasure of before serious business and ran up more debts. Louis XVI, a well-meaning but weak and indecisive. He did, however, wisely choose Jacques Necker, a financial expert, as an advisor. Necker urged the king to reduce extravagant court spending, reform government, and abolish burdensome tariffs on internal trade. When Necker proposed taxing the first and second estates, however, the nobles and high clergy forced the king to dismiss him. As the crisis deepened, the pressure for reform mounted. The wealthy and powerful classes demanded, however, that the king summon the Estates General, the legislative body consisting of representatives of the three estates, before making any changes. A French king had not called the Estates General in 175 years, fearing that nobles would use it to recover their feudal powers that they had lost under absolute rule. To reform-minded nobles, the Estates General seemed to offer a chance of carrying out changes like those that had come with the Glorious Revolution in England. They hoped that they could bring the absolute monarch under the control of the nobles and guarantee their own privileges. Checkpoint. What economic troubles did France face in 1789, and how did they lead to further unrest? Louis XVI calls the Estates General. In 1788 came to a close, France tottered on the verge of bankruptcy. Bread riots were spreading, and nobles, fearful of taxes, were denouncing royal tyranny. A baffled Louis XVI finally summoned the Estates General to meet at Versailles the following year. Estates prepare grievance notebooks. In preparation, Louis had all three estates prepare cahiers, or notebooks, listing their grievances. Many cahiers called for reforms such as fair taxes, freedom of the press, or regular meetings of the Estates General. In one town, shoemakers denounced regulations that made leather so expensive they could not afford to make shoes. Servant girls in the city of Toulouse demanded the right to leave service when they wanted, and that after a girl had served her master for many years, she received some reward for her service. The cahiers testified to boiling class resentments. One called tax collectors bloodsuckers of the nation who drink the tears of the unfortunate from goblets of gold. Another one of the cahiers condemned the courts of the nobles as vampires pumping the last drop of blood from the people. Another complained that 20 million must live on half the wealth of France while the clergy devour the other half. Delegates take the tennis court oath. Delegates to the Estates General from the Third Estate were elected, though only propertied men could vote. Thus, the delegates were mostly lawyers, middle-class officials, and writers. They were familiar with the writings of Voltaire, Rousseau, and other philosophers. They went to Versailles not only to solve the financial crisis, but also to insist on reform. The Estates General convened in May 1789. From the start, the delegates were deadlocked over the issue of voting. Traditionally, each state had met and voted separately. Each group had one vote. Under this system, the first and second estates always outvoted the third estate 2-1. This time, the third estate wanted all three estates to meet in a single body with votes counted by head. After weeks of stalemate, delegates of the third estate took a daring step. In June 1789, claiming to represent the people of France, they declared themselves to be the National Assembly. A few days later, the National Assembly found its meeting hall locked and guarded. Fearing that the king planned to dismiss them, the delegates moved to a nearby indoor tennis court. As curious spectators looked on, the delegates took their famous tennis court oath. They swore never to separate and to meet whenever the circumstances might require until we have established a sound and just constitution. When reform-minded clergy and nobles joined the assembly, Louis XVI grudgingly accepted it. But royal troops gathered around Paris, and rumors spread that the king planned to dissolve the assembly. Checkpoint. What actions did delegates of the Third Estate take when the Estates General met in 1789? Parisians stormed the Bastille. On July 14, 1789, the city of Paris seized the spotlight from the National Assembly meeting in Versailles. The streets buzzed with rumors that royal troops were going to occupy the capital. More than 800 Parisians assembled outside the Bastille, a grim medieval fortress used as a prison for political and other prisoners. The crowd demanded weapons and gunpowder believed to be stored there. The commander of the Bastille refused to open the gates and opened fire on the crowd. In the battle that followed, many people were killed. Finally, the enraged mob broke through their defenses. They killed the commander and 5 guards and released a handful of prisoners who were being held there, but found no weapons. The Bastille was a symbol of the people of France, represented years of abuse by the monarchy. The storming and subsequent fall of the Bastille was a wake-up call to Louis XVI. Unlike other riot or short-lived protest, this event posed a challenge to the sheer existence of the regime. Since 1880, the French have celebrated Bastille Day annually as their National Independence Day. Checkpoint. What was the significance of the storming of the Bastille? That is the end of your reading for Chapter 18, Section 1. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.